For some reason, my wife never stopped asking if I would still love her if she were a worm, an animal, or a bug. That was a question I had never really considered before. She used to say it, and I'd chuckle because I assumed it was just one of those nice, hypothetical things that lovers say to each other. Without fail, I assured her that I would. She would cock her head, narrow her eyes slightly, and then nod, content, before shifting her attention to something else. She was just delightful to me, not the kind of passionate, outspoken love that ends in flames or seeks validation from outside sources. Like breathing, which you take for granted most of the time yet is essential to your survival, I adored her. Because of her, everything seemed softer and less harsh. Her unique perspective gave everything a vibrant quality. The room seemed crowded even when she was completely silent, engrossed in her tea and crossword puzzle at the kitchen table. Everything was touched by her presence. Every one of her peculiarities was a quirk. She was adamant about not killing any bugs in the house, regardless of their leg count. No matter where she slept, she was adamant about being on the left side of the bed. Even the dead trees we passed on our hike were spared her little apologies. And she had strange beliefs, in a subtle, individualistic manner, not a delusional one, subjects she had never before imposed on anybody. Some birds, she thought, could communicate with humans. Rather than seeing the number 13 as bad luck, she saw it as sacrosanct. On top of that, she thought a rosary might ward off evil spirits. Every day, she carried that rosary. She always had it on her every time she left the house. Depending on the occasion, she would wear it wrapped around her waist or tucked under a shirt. It persisted nevertheless. The reason behind it was never discussed, at least not by her. Something had occurred to her when she was young, and that was all I knew. During her 14th year, her entire family was killed in a vehicle accident. Out of all the people trapped in the debris, she was the sole survivor. She transformed into the careful woman I know now after that. I finally got it. The rosary had nothing to do with religion. She clutched onto the thread, her armor, so she wouldn't come undone. No, I never doubted it. To appreciate it, I needed not comprehend it. The idea of the retreat had actually come from her. We considered taking a few months off to relax and let the world pass us by. However, the plan never materialized. Every time, something new arose. Job, running errands, and people requiring items. By the fall of that year, she had circled the dates on the calendar and was ready to bring it up again. According to her, she had discovered an ideal spot, a rustic cabin in the middle of the woods that perfectly suited her taste. She expressed her desire to experience air that had not been filtered through vents. The bizarre silence that came with being alone, the scent of wood smoke in her hair, and the tranquility of the pine branches above her were all things she yearned for. Without even requesting to view the location, I consented. It appeared that the location would remain chilly, regardless of your efforts to make it warmer when she subsequently showed me the images. Both the walls and the windows were somewhat narrow. A small dock protruded from behind the trees, offering a view of a shadowy lake. After I told her it was wonderful, she applauded. I vowed to her before we left that I would accompany her on the trekking trail. She dismissed my inquiry about the duration, claiming it was irrelevant and that we will find out. Then she uttered something that would occupy my thoughts for the rest of the day. "I won't want to come back once we get there," she said. We were both amused. Evidently, she meant it to be a joke. We kissed. I laughed too, and then we gathered all of our belongings. Most of the day was devoted to the drive out. She became more subdued as the tree line thickened on both sides of the windshield and the road became narrower. As her hair fluttered in the breeze, she allowed her hand to dangle from the window. Gentle rays of sunlight streamed through the pane of glass. Dusk had already descended by the time we ascended the gravel road and beheld the cabin emerge from behind the woods. We could hear the porch squeak as we stepped inside, and the door clung slightly before finally opening. The walls were also scented with a combination of mildew and pine sap. However, my assumption was incorrect. The location was actually rather warm. She moved at a leisurely pace, running her fingers along the furnishings and gazing out the windows as if trying to commit every scene to memory. After that, she stomped her feet off the worn couch, grumbled, and kicked off her shoes. For our evening activity, we gathered around a fire and sat on the floor before it. First to fall asleep was she. Her breaths became as rhythmic as the wind rustling the roof. For a long period, I slept poorly. I remained at her side, observing her face as it wandered through her dreams. I observed the ebb and flow of the chest. I could still feel her grip on my hand. That stillness brought me an unfathomable calm, and I loved her more than I had ever loved her before. It was as if the world outside the trees had never existed. She appeared weightless. We got a head start the following morning because the air was still chilly from the night before. She was fully prepared, with her boots lacing up and a canvas bag containing water, a journal, and a snack that she was certain we would overlook. A shattered wooden post buried in the underbrush served as the only marker at the trailhead, which was behind the cabin and was partially obscured by ferns. With deliberate strides and a little smile that persisted in nipping at her lip, she guided the group. As I trailed closely behind, I noticed her braid rubbing against her bag's shoulder strap. The path was difficult. Ankles were the ones that finally brought the roots up from the dirt. As we wound our way around hillsides where downed trees huddled together above, the gradient became steeper. After the first mile, we were followed by a creek. The surface is first thin and fragmented by pebbles and drifting pale green leaves that don't seem to be in a hurry. Light filtered through the slow-moving ribbons of pine needles. It wiggled its way between drooping and bending limbs as she walked. On sometimes, faraway birds fluttered. No long-term conversations, just a couple of brief phone calls. As we ascended, we noticed that pockets of heavier moss had crawled up the edges of the stones. I couldn't help but associate the yellowing of some of it with old wounds rather than new growth. We were quite quiet. That wasn't necessary. Both hers and mine remained steady as we breathed. From time to time, she would glance back to make sure I was still following. Then we would exchange smiles and continue on our way. The length of time we walked is a mystery to me. The pain in my legs had intensified, and the way the shadows had moved made it seem like it was getting close to noon. Once again, the stream had veered away from the trail when she abruptly halted and cocked her head to the side. I watched as her shoulders shifted as she stepped through a canopy of leaves, her fingertips brushing aside the foliage. She failed to summon my assistance. She remained motionless, her gaze fixed on an object just beyond the verdant cloak. We stood silently as I rose to be by her side. In the middle of a circle of twisted trees, a dark rock basin had emerged. A round spring, little bigger than a small room, formed when the stream re-emerged. Sluggishly and patiently, its surface shimmered, capturing light in patterns that didn't appear to correspond with the wind's movement above. From afar, the water appeared transparent, yet its eerie calm betrayed an unnatural quality. There were no gliding leaves or insects skimming the surface. Something under the surface, like a strain that wouldn't let it ripple, seemed to be holding it together. She took the lead, descending the slope to the pool's edge first. I trailed along, being cautious not to trip over the wet stone. As I knelt down next to her and extended my hand to touch the water, I braced myself for a shiver. However, when I ran my fingertips over it, it felt thick and slightly resistant until finally giving up. Afterward, my skin was covered in an indefinable substance. The oil stuck to me for a few seconds before vanishing in the wind, albeit it was actually water. There was a discernible warming of the air surrounding the spring. There was a complete and utter shift. Underneath my rolled sleeves, my exposed arms felt hot and flushed. My breathing became somewhat more labored for no apparent reason, and the perspiration on my back surfaced more quickly. It was as if she were oblivious. As she submerged her hand, she observed the water transform into a transparent sheen around her wrist. A small parting of her lips occurred, but she remained silent. As if she were undressing before a relic of antiquity, her fingers tenderly traced the path of the chain around her neck. As I saw, she took the rosary from under her shirt and untied it. A subtle green patina began to spread around the crucifix's curve, and the metal links had worn down with the years. Before speaking, she gazed at it for an extended period. According to her, it's delicate and aged. I would prefer that it not corrode in this substance. Pressing the worn cotton cloth, soft and faded, out of her pocket, she folded the rosary into it and placed it flat against the rock near the pool. She anchored each corner with her palm, as if terrified the wind could try to steal it, smoothing it out with her hand. I unlaced my boots after patiently waiting for her to finish. The moss-covered stone was cold and slippery underfoot, but the air was still warm, as if we were walking inside a greenhouse isolated from the forest. It felt like a warm embrace on my shoulders and cheeks. Without making a sound, her bare foot broke the surface as she stepped in first. Without a fight, the water took her in. With her arms extended for stability, she cautiously made her way to the spring's center. She was covered with something that caught the light unevenly, and her flesh shimmered slightly where the water touched it as the surface rose to her hips. As I followed suit, I dipped my toes into the pool one after the other. With a gasp, I forced myself to breathe. It had an unusual, somewhat gelatinous texture. It was less resistant to her approach than mine was. I felt the pressure of the surface tension on my ankles. As I walked, the water encircled me. As I approached her, she pivoted to face me, her hair tousled back, and a few drops of rain pattering across her collarbone. She then flashed a broad, brilliant smile. Pouring a small amount of water into my palms, I let it to trickle down my fingers. Its after effects were subtle but noticeable, something thicker than anticipated. Silence was mine. She probably wouldn't have wanted my worried expression to spoil the surprise. My smile persisted. Time seemed to have stopped for us as we remained there for a while, encircled by immobile trees and floating on water that never rippled. As she calmed herself, her respiration became more regular. She submerged for a short instant, and upon her return to the surface, her laughter resounded like a hallowed sound. When I got back to the cabin, I'd have to scrub my skin more vigorously than normal just to feel clean. Standing by her side in the spring, however, the only thing I could perceive was the lady I loved, radiating in the filtered sunlight. After a while, we emerged from the water and began to head back. On the stroll, she became more silent. For a moment there, I blamed the exhaustion she was feeling from the hike. After a hard day on the walk, we were hot and parched when we finally reached the spring. She walked with shorter and slower strides. She accepted the water silently, pressing the bottle to her forehead before taking a sip. As she returned it, her hand quivered a little. As we made our way to the cabin, the sun had already set behind the woods. Her feet rested on the side of the bed as she leaned forward and massaged her temples. Her lips remained tightly pursed as she nodded in response to my inquiry about her well-being. She was silent for a while before finally speaking. She whispered, "I'm not feeling well. My head is throbbing and my stomach is in knots. I simply require a brief period of rest." I removed her shoes and covered her with the blanket. Breathing slowly and shallowly, she curled down onto her side with her knees tucked in. I brushed a few hairs from her face as I sat next to her till she closed her eyes. The fire pit behind the cabin was empty, the logs uncut, and her forehead was wet. There was no need for me to light anything inside. Draped across the walls in muted patterns, the last rays of sunlight crept through the curtains. I stood motionless by the window, taking in nothing more than the sound of the house's respiration. After she had slept off later that night, I went outside to get some fresh air. The wind was hardly blowing, yet it was enough to rustle the trees and agitate the ferns. I recalled the rosary as I made my way back inside. Beside the spring, on the flat rock, we had placed it, delicately wrapped in the towel. I pondered the possibility that she might have lost it. After she had placed her luggage on the counter earlier, I made my way into the cabin to verify. She had kept some smaller items in a pouch, and I opened it. So far, no luck. The cloth that she had used to cover it was eventually located on the nightstand next to her bed, nicely folded. It was now more refined. Lines parallel. The rosary, however, had slipped out. I took it into my hands, flipped it over, and then opened the drawer under it to make sure she hadn't shifted anything. Not a little. Still motionless, she peered over my shoulder. First thing in the morning, I brewed some tea and sat down at the foot of the bed to watch her sip it. Her eyes were tired and her face pallid. I inquired about the rosary, and she paused to take a second sip before responding. She stated calmly, "I'll just get another one." Her voice was faint. "It is merely an item. The thought is distracting me at the moment." Silence was mine. I waited for her to finish the sentence, the part where she would explain why she was laughing and admitting she was forgetful, and I suppose I simply blinked at her for a split second. But it never materialized. Never before had she considered it insignificant. That rosary had always held a special place in her heart ever since I met her. She used it for sleeping and traveling. On one occasion, she discovered she had left the automobile on the kitchen counter and proceeded to turn around halfway to her friend's wedding. Furthermore, it had vanished at that moment. She appeared unconcerned about it all. Attempting to determine if I should continue or move on, I gazed at her for more time than was necessary. Her expression stayed unchanged as she stared at the cup in her hands. There was a noticeable difference in the room's thickness compared to the previous night, as if something had been removed. The following night, I awoke to chilly sheets. The entire time I was asleep, her side of the bed had been there, unmoved. It was a flat blanket. There was no form or substance to her pillow. The little bulb resting on the dresser emitted a muted brightness that formed a muted shadow on the wall. In the stillness, I sat up and blinked, trying to hear footsteps, a sound of creaking and sighing. Identifying her whereabouts would be my greatest concern. No response came from the cabin. Once, then again with more volume, I screamed out her name. There was no response. Before I could process what was happening, my feet landed on the floor. A shiver ran down my spine as I felt the cold air snap at my flesh. I pried open the door to the restroom. Not a little. Look in the kitchen. Not a little. Nothing moved, not even the front porch. I had already stepped out barefoot onto the moist boards when I noticed she wasn't inside. Behind me, in the pitch-black stillness, the silhouettes of the trees were illuminated by the moonlight. I shot over to the path. The twigs snapped under my feet when I stepped on the bitter ground, and the mud was slippery from the fallen leaves. Shouting her name once more caused my voice to crack, and the sound eventually left my throat. I rolled off the hollowed-out and broken tree trunks. Despite my chest pain and brief gasps of breath, I continued going farther than I had anticipated she could go. I was trembling. Suddenly, she appeared before my eyes. With her arms relaxed at her sides and her locks gently illuminated by the moonlight, she leisurely emerged from the trees. Quiet and unruffled, she wore a look of tranquility as a gentle smile pulled at her lips. She simply wanted to go back to the springs. They were quite cozy. Were they not warm, in your opinion? She advanced a little and extended her hand to shake mine. Totally still. My physical self was unresponsive. My instincts were too muted to be audible, yet they were strong enough to make me gag and choke. Nodding, I gave the signal. I was at a loss for what to do next. She started walking again in the direction of the cottage. I proceeded accordingly. The fever went away in a few days. Her appetite came back and she walked more easily. Mornings were no longer spent clutching her tummy or flinching at the light by the windows. She seemed to be okay on the outside. However, the one I loved never returned from the woods. She had inappropriate laughter fits. Her responses were devoid of context, as if she had skipped over the intervening bits. She gave me the silent treatment for a few seconds before she mustered up a smile in response to my teasing about an old joke. There was never a good landing spot for her reactions. They were either too sluggish or too quick. A bird's collision with the outer glass made her flinch. I lost control of a spoon, and she leaped. She seemed to be trying to hide her presence from the house as she moved more quietly. Her steps spread out too far across the hardwood floors. Different felt the touch. When we held hands, hers was warm, but now it was cold. Her fingers were too motionless as they pressed against my flesh, doing more to pretend to be gentle than to actually provide any relief. When I drew her near, she refrained from leaning against my chest. When she slept on my shoulder, she didn't even breathe. Still, she had arrived, and she was beginning to feel better. It was significant. Wow, that was impressive. Therefore, I chose to create a present for her. I dug some driftwood near the trail's edge and pulled some twine out of the drawer. After chopping them into smaller pieces, I sanded them on stone until their edges were smooth enough to touch my skin with ease. I painstakingly threaded each bead into the next, mimicking the shape of the rosary she had always worn, while silently reciting her name between each addition. Finally, I tied them neatly and securely, and I grasped the improvised chain in my hand. It wasn't attractive, but it was substantial. I presented it to her that night. Before taking it, she gave it a long look. With her corners of her mouth folded, she stroked her fingertips over the wood. No joy there. She spoke in a hushed voice, stating that she did not require such things. She silently placed it on the table and strolled by me, abandoning the present in its original state. For what seemed like an eternity, I just stood there, gazing at the twine and wood loop below. It was a strong knot that I tied. It was all right, I told myself. Perhaps she was not herself. Perhaps space was what she needed. Took it in stride. I felt compelled to do so. As we nestled under the cozy blanket on the couch that night, she raised her head to peer out the dark window and whispered, "We ought to go. Next week." With the expectation of a smile, I beheld her. None existed. Unable to read the glass in the low light, her gaze remained fixed on it. "This is my home," she declared. She had pleaded for this trip and joked about never wanting to leave, so I brought it up again. She remained silent. She merely recited the lines, this time at a slower pace, as if they were trying to convey some meaning that I was misinterpreting. I felt for her hand beneath the covers that night as I lay in bed. There was no force as her fingers pressed against mine. Even with the comforter covering her, her skin felt chilly. Upon the power outage, she refrained from closing her eyes. She was still wide awake and staring ahead when I opened mine hours later, so I knew. As soon as she woke up, I peered into the mirror and saw her combing her hair. She was illuminated by the light streaming in from the bathroom window, yet her eyes remained unblinking. They absorbed the light without reflecting it. Absence of refraction and sheen. It was only that motionless surface I had beheld in spring. Shortly after the clock struck 3, the crashing began. While she breathed slowly and evenly next to me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She remained untouched. It was too much for me to handle. She seemed uninvitingly cold due to the immobility in her body. All it did was bring to mind how much time had passed since I'd experienced it. The front door and its hinges were rattled by the initial noise. There was a damp thud, and then nothing. Then came another, much louder, as if some heavy object had suddenly materialized. With purpose, not fury. One pane of glass groaning against its frame indicated that the third knock had been sufficiently forceful to rattle the windows. Nothing moved her. I got out of bed and my feet tapped softly on the hardwood floor. In front of me, the corridor extended, its dimness enhanced by shifting shadows caused by my every step. I was nervous when I turned the handle. For days the cabin had felt unsafe, but now it was different. As I yanked open the door, the fourth knock sounded. Prior to that, I noticed it. The monster, which was too tall to be seen in a single glimpse, stood beneath the porch light. Coated in a see-through fluid that crawled slowly over its own skin, its body shimmered. A film grabbed the light and distorted it into otherworldly colors, making every surface shimmer. Our eyes met for an extended while as we gazed at one another. Trembling slightly, its skull was divided into 3 long plates that were torn off from the crown. The plates were oriented outward. The inside margins of the plates were damp and unfinished, and the plates bent with sharp seams, showing a gap where a skull ought to have been. There was no center or symmetry to the face, if there was one at all. Instead, there were those 3 trembling plates that opened up around nothing. The 4 large slabs of flesh that made up the mouth moved independently, retracted to expose the tongue within in the shape of unequal petals. Huge, bulging black skin covered in a glossy coating that mirrored every movement. The biting continued non-stop. Its heartbeat echoed through the vast sky. From its breast dangled tentacles. They weren't swaying or still. With slow, purposeful movements, they flexed inward and outward, measuring the distance to the cabin's door. Their pointed tips were too small to contain any bone, and they seemed to be reaching for the sky as if it held the answers. In some spots, its muscle tissue was exposed due to skin tears or non-formation. With every tiny motion, the exposed fiber flexed, its thick and dark veins winding in webs across the surface. They were vibrating just under the skin, but their rhythm was so odd that it twisted my gut. Yellow pus bubbled up from multiple rips in the flesh and slowly and heavily trickled down, collecting around the base of its legs. At the point where it touched the porch, the liquid hissed, but no smoke billowed. Aside from the sound of leaking, there was no odor thereafter. I couldn't help but gasp as I beheld those eyes. Too much space separated them. A thick, steady-flowing material came out of each of them. Not water, but thick, glossy tears. They moved slowly and uninterruptedly down the creature's face, glowing slightly as they went. The animal appeared to be inconsolable. The monstrous being stooped down. A voice attempt was made. A scratchy and slurred sound emerged, its voice marred by dampness and the numerous folds of shredded flesh. The sound was like a gurgling breath. Just a moment. "Excuse me, ma'am." Wet vowels seeping out of something that was never meant to speak, creating a sound like rotting flesh. When it first came out, I had no idea what it meant. I could feel my legs beginning to stir. Then I bolted. Looking back was not something I did. After I turned around, the door swung open and pounded so hard on the wall that it cracked. Sweat drenched my icy feet as they stomped on the flooring, a sound that could rouse the dead. Panic made my lungs feel like they were going to burst. With a raspy, cracked voice, I called out a name as I walked. I nearly tore the hinge off the bedroom door when I pounded it open. With her eyes wide open and her arms neatly folded over the blanket, she lies flat beneath the blankets, staring at the ceiling. Unfazed, she continued. Her pupils were enormous, engulfing her iris color, and her whites had taken on a subtle yellowish hue that was absent the previous night. As soon as I saw her, I knelt down, reached out, and shook her softly at first, and then more forcefully. "The time has come for us to depart." With the motion, her head cocked ever so slightly, but her stare remained fixed. As her chest rose and fell in a calm, steady beat, her lips remained closed. Behind me in the corridor resounded the cracking of wood. The thing had made its way inside, and the house swayed under its weight. Taking a firm grip on the door, I stood up and banged it shut. Under my palm, the lock clicked into position, but I was certain it wouldn't make a difference. My skin was raw and wet with perspiration as my heart pounded so loudly that it resounded in my ears. I stared at her through shapeless sobs as I leaned against the door and whispered a name. In silence, she remained motionless. No way could we depart. There was just no way out. It had already reached us, whatever it was that I had allowed in. The monster swung around to the door and swung right through it. Everywhere you looked, wood splintered as the hinges tore the frame from the door. As it slid under the low ceiling, its body curved inward. Its weight caused the floor to sag as it cried steadily, its viscous fluid dropping to the earth in a soundless cascade. Blindly, I extended my hand toward the bedside table, and my fingers encircled the improvised rosary I had fashioned for her. I fashioned the twine and the driftwood pieces for her hands using my own knife. With all the energy I could muster, I pivoted and threw it at the monster. I needed help badly. It landed on its floor after hitting its chest. Unchanged, the beast stood with a cocked head and slightly quivering plates. So it swung around. On my part, no. As it sprinted for the bed, it shook the room. It wasn't until it was pressing down on my lying wife that she reacted. With its enormous limbs pressing against the bed, it pinned her down. Her jaw dropped in a long, drawn-out gasp. After flailing her arms once, she ceased. As I dove headfirst into the beast, my fists pounded against the muscle close to its ribs, and I was soon swallowed whole by the soft, moving flesh. I pounded it repeatedly while yelling through my teeth, but it did not respond. It was like rain on mud. My punches didn't do anything. The monstrous being had lowered itself to retrieve the rosary, which it had previously raised above her face before squeezing between her fangs. Screaming broke out of her. The sound didn't reverberate as a human voice would. It trembled, bending and twisting in ways my ears failed to comprehend. Its volume increased, it crashed into itself, it turned back around, and it built again. The noise resembled the ripping of glassy flesh or the squeaking of insects in patterns understood by the dead. As if swallowing, she leaned her back against the bed and pulled the rosary further into her lips. Beginning at her shoulders, her skin peeled off in long strips. At first, the hue faded to grey, then pink, and last, something that looked more like translucent meat. Subcutaneously, her skeleton shook. A painful spasm escaped her leg as it twisted inward and folded under her. She rolled her eyes and her jaw loosened. In her last breath, she released a sound that echoed through the room and even the air. I was brought to my knees by a sound. She felt her skin peeling away. It gushed out of the bed, trickling down the wood and soaking through the floorboard seams. Her body melted. Her spinal column coiled inward, and she vanished beneath the covers. She departed after that. The only remnants of my sleep were the damp spot that had spread across the bed and the burden that would not budge from my chest. My knees gave out from under me, and I fell backward. Anguish wasn't the worst thing that tore my chest inward. After my already ragged throat let out a scream of the name, I let out another scream when nothing came out of it. It sounded like nothing but sadness. The being remained still, its ribs extending at irregular intervals as it breathed shallowly. Next, it carefully shifted its gaze to meet mine. Words didn't even leave its lips before they escaped. Once guttural and gurgling, the sound was now subdued. Words still landed with purpose, but this time they were forced through layers of damp tissue and misaligned bone. "My apologies," it stated. "Without it, I would have been unable to demonstrate anything to you. Ever since the water, she has been inside of me. She, or it, absorbed my form and inserted me into its own. It was a no-go for me. In a state of intense need for a solid object to grasp onto, my hands spontaneously rose, fingers curved. "No, no," I whispered. In quiet, uncoordinated motions, the monster knelt. He felt his chest widen, its tentacles spread out, one of them reaching for the ground. Emerging from its hideous depths was a fragile item, holy water, the authentic one. The crucifix was still scratched from where she used to tinker with it on long car drives, and the silver chain was dull and worn at the edges. As a bridge between us, it laid the rosary. It said that I recall every detail. Without this rosary, I would be lost without it. I am incredibly terrified, as you are aware. On the final syllable, its voice cracked. Its insides quivered. Nothing physical, but the spirit that resides within. I also didn't spot a single animal, which was a first. I failed to detect any danger. I beheld her. Then I remained. I continued scrubbing the floor until the spills disappeared. In the back of the cabin, I grabbed the bedsheets and put them in the fireplace. I waited for the smoke to be carried away by the wind into the woods while I felt the heat on my skin and watched them burn to threads. No, she stayed put. Same here. At first, we made our way silently through the home. She cautiously made her way through each room. As she moved, her body cast damp shadows all over the room. My name is I Cooked. When I gave her food, she ate it. She skipped the fork and spoon. She exhibited unusual hand movements, with joints bending in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. I whispered something to her. She sobbed, and I comforted her. The thick strands of her eyelashes stuck to my flesh, although I refrained from removing them. Her loose, quivering tendrils wrapped around my wrist. She remained true to herself no matter what she changed into or what she wore. Undeterred, she remained intact. Every morning I would bring her tea, the same blend she had adored before, brewed for a longer period of time than normal, so that the room would be filled with the aroma she had mentioned as reminding her of autumn. Now she took sips from a bowl. Despite her impaired oral function, she managed to consume the liquid. After finishing the plate, she clutched it near to her bosom, as if the comforting warmth held some significance. Talking was our thing. She inquired about our activities. Though fragmented, her recollection persisted. Information that I had forgotten was jogged to her. We experienced our first storm as a couple in a cinnamon-scented hotel, and later, while gasping for petrol, we slow danced in the parking lot to her favorite song. Some things had an effect on her spirit, and she recalled them. There were nights when I would sit across from her and just look. For a while, I just let my thoughts roam. Reminiscent of her state just before spring, I witnessed her hands running through her hair as she sat softly in the light of the fire. Her shoulders relaxed, and her feet resting lightly on the couch for a moment. Her smile prompted me to convince myself that I was helpless in the face of the challenge. She struggled to convey the emotion on her face. Her jaw was open on both sides, sagging downward in slow, trembling arcs, and her flesh was stretched unevenly across too many teeth. Though it belonged on an alien face, the smile was kind. I could tell it belonged to her. Therefore, my answer is yes, I would love my wife unconditionally,